Hey everyone, Tim here. I'm going to bring you a preview of World Championships Group B. I know that Group D won the Twitter poll, got the most votes. You know, a lot of TSM fans out there who really want to hear about that group, I think. And, you know, if I have time, I'd like to get to Group D as well. But Group B stood out to me a little bit more, kind of called to me that this is the one that I felt most compelled to comment on. So I'm going to go through Group B. I'm going to go through the four teams. Look at some of the strengths and weaknesses of each team, things that they, you know, so for each team, I'm going to have one core question that kind of needs to be answered about, you know, if this is one of the key pieces of whether they're going to find success or not. And I'm going to try to kind of contrast them against the group and what their chances are. And I'm going to do it in the order of my own kind of pick'em rankings of which team, kind of power ranking the four teams. And just before I get into, like I said, I'm going to go strengths and weaknesses for each team. When I'm going to try to highlight both positives and negatives. I have a feeling that it's going to feel more like I'm skewing towards the criticisms and the negative aspects of each team. And I think, you know, that I don't want that to give the impression that I think these are weak teams or that these teams, you know, aren't up to the caliber of the overall tournament or anything like that. I think every team was a winner in the stage to get here, whether they directly won in the summer playoffs or the regional qualifiers, or whether they were really successful in spring and, you know, did good enough in summer to get through. These are all winning teams and good teams. I'd say some are good, some are great, right? We're not talking about bad teams here. So when I'm talking about criticisms of the teams, I just think that's often a more productive area to discuss. When you're praising a team or a player, it can get a little bit, you know, you want to acknowledge the strengths, but you don't want to just kind of keep praising a team, and it gets a little monotonous, I think. So there's maybe a little more richness to the discussion when you're talking about criticisms, things they need to improve, potential vulnerabilities. But I'm going to try to touch on both, so hopefully it won't feel too much of a downer on any of the teams. So I'm going to just remind you, first of all, Group B includes four teams. We've got Flash Wolves from the LMS, we've got SKT from Korea, Cloud9 from North America, and IMA from China. So let's start with the team that I have ranked fourth, which is IMA. And up front, I just want to, you know, I want to say that I like how scrappy they are. They're very persistent. They'll stick in a game when they're playing from behind, and they don't just go away. So I like that, and I think it fits the narrative of their team over the split as a whole. You know, when they qualified into the summer split, nobody expected them to be a Worlds contending team, or a team contending to go to Worlds. But they kept proving, they kept fighting. They made it all the way through, you know, some tough losses in a 5-game series in the regional qualifiers. And, you know, I think their persistence and their perseverance is really good. I like some of their individual players. I think Avoidless and Road and Amazing J are all worth calling out as good players. I wouldn't personally call any of them really great players. I think they're good. But they all have each their own weaknesses. I'm not going to get into a breakdown of each individual player, though. But when I watch them, I see a lot of issues, and this is the reason why I've got them ranked fourth in the group. To start, I think their macro overall is often very questionable. So they don't always read the game situation the way, at least I think they should be reading it. They don't read the way the two comps match up and how they should be trying to play them. So when they're in a split pushing composition that they've drafted themselves into, they'll often put themselves into a 5v5 team fight situation where they aren't really, you know, that's not what they should be doing at the moment, and putting themselves into a disadvantaged situation. Or if the enemy is split pushing and there's a chance to you know, one of the side laner for the enemy team is pushed up a little too far and they haven't established their second pressure point yet, I might have an opportunity to kind of go and outman that person, get a pick, and then find a power play somewhere else. But instead, they kind of move as 5 off and find the main group, and again, they end up in this team fight scenario. So I think that there's some questions about their macro and the way they set up the map and the way they move around the map and make their choices, and that's one of the big weaknesses for me. Their team fighting doesn't impress me very much either. I think maybe part of it is the fact that they put themselves into these team fight scenarios where they aren't really comped for it, or the game situation doesn't really call for it. But the execution of their team fights has stood out to me as having some issues that they need to get around. And I think maybe some of the communication, they're a multi-language team, as you may have heard from other sources, and the communication might be part of that, but I'm not really sure. They play from behind way too much, and their inability to get early leads consistently is a big issue. And I think in this group especially, that's going to be a really big issue for them. So, I said before that I admire how well they're able to persevere within a game and try to come from behind, but the fact that they are playing from behind so often is a big problem. So we saw this in the postseason for them when they're playing against Snake in the playoffs and they're playing against Royal. Arguably the fifth game against Team WE in the Gauntlet. Those games all involved falling way behind, and then they came back and won. But a big problem is that many of those games involved big throws by the enemy team, and relying on the other team to throw. Great, you lingered around and you had the opportunity to kind of receive the throw, but you can't rely on the enemy team to throw when you get to this level of play. So I think that's a big problem for me as well. So the big question for me, for IMA going to this group, is can they survive the early game? Because if they consistently fall behind, then there's still a chance that they get these opportunities to make the comebacks, but it's pretty questionable, and it's not a very reliable way to win games. Move on to the team I have ranked third, which is Flash Wolves. This is the LMS first seed, so they're the pool 1 seed for the group, but I'm not really sold on them. So the positives up front, I think they are good at getting early leads. This is part of, they're one of the teams that are a reason why I have IMA ranked fourth. Flash Wolves, Cloud9, and to some extent SKT are all good at getting early leads in different ways. For Flash Wolves, they make some coordinated plays. Karsa is a very good jungler. Maple is really strong in lane and can get, move around the map a little bit. And I think, their ability to do that and coordinate the way they kind of set up these early moves is very commendable. Their vision game is really strong. It's really interesting looking at both of the LMS teams. They place just a ton of wards, or at least they did they have since patch 6.15 came out. I don't have the number in front of me, but they are very, very high warding teams. And when you watch the Flash Wolves, their vision cover is solid. They have the vision kind of where they need it. I think now and then they kind of over ward a little bit, arguably, which is, a much better problem to have than under warding. But it does mean sometimes that you're spending too much time in base refreshing your sight stones or whatever it is. You could be out on the map a little bit more, setting up plays, things like this. So, but in general, I think their vision game is a big positive. A weakness of them for me is that they are often too passive in the mid and late game. They can establish these early leads, but it takes them sometimes just forever to close out the game. So in the LMS summer playoffs, I believe their average game length was something like 45 minutes, even though they had these really big gold leads often, and quite a strong early game. They just have a really hard time, it seems, setting up proactive kind of positive plays where they can kind of start a snowball and turn the lead into a bigger lead and a bigger lead. And as an example, when Maple plays Talia, I love watching Maple play Talia. He plays it like a carry. I mentioned it in a previous video. But rather than using Talia to get out of mid lane and jump into a side lane, create a 2v1 or a 3v1 if he syncs up with Karsa, and get a kill, and if you get that kill and you have the wave push to the tower at the same time, if you set up the play right, then you get a kill and a tower, right? And that's a big snowball opportunity. But what you'd often see Maple using his Talia ultimates for is the whole team moves up into a side lane, which takes a little more time to set up, because you have to know that you're not leaving another part of the map vulnerable because there are more members moving. And then they would use the ult to create a wall behind the tower and kind of section off the defenders. And maybe they'd catch one or two kind of on the tower side and they'd be able to dive them, but usually not. They'd just kind of be scaring the other team off or pushing the other team back while they hit the tower. So sometimes, a lot of the time, that'll get them the tower, but it's not going to get them any kills because it took too long to set up. It was too slow moving. It was kind of telegraphed, and it's not like the proactive, aggressive kind of play that is going to turn a lead into a much bigger lead. It's very slow, and takes a lot of setup. So that's one of the issues with the Flash Wolves is those are the types of plays they make when they're playing with the lead, and I think they need to be much, not much more aggressive, but they need to find a way to be more proactive and find the right types of plays to really create big leads, and keep the leads growing. And that plays also into, it's part of their also poor macro, I think. I'm not a big fan of the way they play the map. Their split pushing is the one that has really stood out to me. When I watch their games and I see them often when they're split pushing, and they don't set up kind of their 2 points of pressure very well. Because the idea in split pushing is if we're talking just a simple kind of 4-1 split push, is you want to have the one lane pushing up and threatening a tower, or whatever objective it is. Usually the tower is the single person. And the other group has to be also simultaneously applying pressure to a second point. So whether that's 2 towers in different lanes, or the other group might be on the Baron. So you've got 4 people kind of clearing the Baron area and saying, hey, we could start this Baron at any moment, and the other person's off in bottom lane, kind of hitting the tower and hopefully winning the 1v1 there. But watching Flash Wolves, you sometimes see it where the one person will start to approach the tower, but the other group, say they're up in top lane, they still have the wave just past river a little bit, so you can easily wave clear bottom, and then by the time that player has gotten another, they has had to back off, so MMD usually would be the split pusher, he has to back off, and the 4-man group is only then starting to get their wave pushed in, which means that the defending team can then rotate around, clear that wave, and it's very easy for them to just kind of jump back and forth and manage both parts of it. So Flash Wolves aren't hitting kind of both of these points of pressure at the same time and forcing the really tough defending decisions. And I just think their split pushing needs a lot of work, and hopefully that's something they are working on. Because the coordination of that and the communication of that is quite a challenge, and not a lot of teams do it super well. But I do think Flash Wolves could do it much better. So a big question for me is, with kind of the slowness of how the Flash Wolves play in the mid and late game, the kind of the lack of going out and creating wins, like seizing leads when they are playing from ahead, are other teams going to play along with that? Because in the LMS, some of the teams did play along with that. But when you come up against some of these stronger teams in the international stage, a team like IMA that isn't afraid to throw a punch and kind of keep the pace going a little bit, and you could say the same thing for the other teams in the group, I think. If the Flash Wolves are too passive and the other teams exploit that could be an issue for them. So if the other teams aren't playing along with what the Flash Wolves prefer to do, they may not feel very comfortable. I have Cloud9 placed second in this group, and so we're going to discuss some of the reasons why. First of all, I'm a big fan of the solo lanes that Cloud9 have, with Impact in top lane, Jensen in mid lane. All the discussion has been around Impact ever since he kind of took over the postseason and had all of his kind of Nara solo kills and other things, and just solo kills everywhere in general, just blowing up everybody he came in contact with. And that was all very impressive, but I think, especially having followed North America, all split and all year, and knowing the type of player Impact is, I think Jensen is getting under-discussed, because he's got a ton of value with his lane dominance and his ability to hard carry games, and he's flexible enough to play utility, although he's not as much on the utility side as someone like Bjergsen. But in general, Cloud9's solo lanes are individually very strong, somewhat different ways, but won't worry about those nuances too much for the moment. I think they, like the Flash Wolves, have good coordination in the early playmaking. They are very good at generating leads. In the North American playoffs, Cloud9 rivaled the kind of early game dominance that TSM had in the regular season, which was really high. So they were generating really big 15-minute gold leads because they have a good way of moving individual pieces around the map and syncing up for a play here, a play there. Interestingly, Meteos isn't always part of that. A lot of games in the playoffs, especially the last couple of series they played, you would see games where Cloud9 would be up like 7-2 in kills or whatever it is, and Meteos would be sitting at maybe like 0-0-2 or something like this. He'd have very low kill participation in the early game. So that's not to just kind of tear down Meteos. He has a lot of strength as well. I'm not super high on his play, and I don't think he's necessarily to the level of some of these international junglers that he's coming up against. But in Cloud9 as a team, whether Meteos is involved or not, they are making good early plays, working through their bottom lane or working through Jensen roaming to either side lane. They're finding kills, creating advantages, winning their lanes, and applying forward pressure, and all of these things are very positive for them, and something they've been quite good at and have gotten much better at over time. Their early vision game. This isn't necessarily a pro or a con for their team, but it's it's kind of an element of discussing the team and describing the team that I think is really important. Because of their movement around the map with individual pieces kind of roaming and moving to different places, it's really important for them to know what the enemy team is doing. And it's not just with their own playmaking, but also knowing, one of the big things Impact has done really well, and he's done it all season long, is that he will absorb pressure and then kind of diffuse that pressure. He won't give up a kill, or at least he'll stall or whatever it is. He won't kind of crumble under that pressure, and that allows Cloud9 either to counter gank or to make a cross map play or whatever it is and find an advantage somewhere else or in response. You need early vision to be able to do that well. So a lot of times Cloud9 would make good use of these situations. Either they'd see an opening and they'd go and make a play of their own with a gank from Meteos, with a roam from Jensen, with a teleport from Impact, whatever it is. A lot of times also Impact would receive a gank, he would survive it, and then they could make a gank almost right away bottom lane, knowing that the enemy jungler wouldn't be there, and they could produce a kill of their own. A lot of times also, especially as they're playing stronger opponents, the enemy team would gank Impact. Impact would either avoid it or sometimes die, because you can't avoid all of them, and Meteos might be farming his own jungle because he didn't see that play coming and he didn't set up the bot lane cross map or the mid lane gank or the top lane counter gank. And a lot of that comes from having holes in their early vision game, gaps in different places. In the early game, you can't cover everything with vision. You just don't have the volume of wards to do it. In the late game, you don't have the volume of wards to cover everything unless you've really got the map pushed up and you're narrowing the zone you have to control. But especially in the early game, you're always going to have holes in your vision. But Cloud9 sometimes has more of those holes than I think they need to. I think they could step up their attention on knowing where they need to have the wards, where the key ward locations are, maybe controlling more of the scuttle crabs, these kinds of things. And I think that's going to be really important when they come up against someone like Flash Wolves, who's going to be sparring with them in the early game. Karsa, in my opinion, a stronger overall jungler than Meteos, and that matchup is going to come down to a lot to who sees whom and who's able to kind of lead the plays and react to the plays properly. So that's a big element of when I watch Cloud9. And then kind of similar to Flash Wolves again, Cloud9, they sometimes have trouble landing the knockout punch when they've got their lead and they've grown their lead and they're getting later in the game. Maybe they've knocked down all the 6 outer towers and they've pushed the waves to the inhibitor towers. They sometimes have trouble landing that knockout punch and actually securing the win. So that's something they're going to have to clean up a little bit as well. Big question for them, tied into the vision game. How well can they read enemy movements? Because both for being proactive and for being reactive, you need to have the information flow to build into their early playmaking and allow their strong solo lanes to be effective. So finally, one more team. And of course, it is SKT. SKT, for me, is a really hard team to read, and I think it is for everyone. And this is why you've seen some people ranking SKT lower on their overall power rankings, or even in this group. Some people are putting Cloud9 ahead of SKT, saying Cloud9 is going to win the group and SKT might come second. I think nobody really has a ton of confidence in how this is going to play out. So these are my 4. I wouldn't be surprised to see it go different ways. I'm relatively confident in these rankings, but SKT is a really big wild card for me, because towards the end of the season, the way we saw them play, honestly, it was really, really unimpressive. It was really underwhelming. The way they played their final series against KT had a lot of gaps in it. I think it was better than the way they played their last few regular season series, but even so, not a ton of improvement. And I think we have to really wonder, especially since we haven't seen them play for so long. They've been practicing ever since early August, I think was kind of their last live series, and we don't really have a great idea what to expect from them. But from watching them and going through kind of how they were playing, here's some of my thoughts on them. So they've obviously got 3 very strong lanes. When Duke is performing to his level, he can be, I think, the best laning top laner in the world. I don't think he has been that this summer. I think in spring he was, no question. But when he is up to that level, he can be one of the best 1v1 top laners in the world, possibly the best. Faker obviously is Faker. His laning has never been in question. Bang and Wolf can be quite good in lane. I don't know if I'd say they're the best dual lane in terms of the 2v2, but they are, they're good in lane. They're strong and they're solid. They are really good at team fighting in the mid and late game. Most of the time, there are some inconsistencies here, and I think if we looked at the SKT that we saw towards the end of the summer split, we might not be able to say all of these things with as much confidence. But in general, and looking more at their overall body of work and who their players are and so on, I think their team fighting is quite good. This is somewhere that Blank, who is one of the big issues with the team in jungle, he's a bit of a question mark, but his team fighting, that is probably his best attribute. He can come in there and really make things happen. With Gragas, for example, he knows how to use his ultimate very well, and his team fighting, I think, is solid. And Bang, an amazing team fighter, really good at getting a ton of damage out. He's outside of China. I think he's probably got the highest DPM, or one of the highest DPMs in the world, even in a region that doesn't fight as often as most other regions. And so their team fighting is very strong. Again, you have Faker. Duke can be a good team fighter as well, when he coordinates to get into those fights properly and when they sync up. But that leads into a couple of the next points. So I guess first I'll touch on Blank a little bit more. His early game is definitely a liability. Given that he has 3 strong laners to work with, and they are often able to push up their lanes, kind of get lane control, he should be able to get into the enemy jungle, track the enemy jungler, or attack the enemy jungler, or whatever he needs to do. But he just so often isn't applying pressure on the map. He isn't using the openings that his teammates give him, and he has a lot of work to do to get to the level that he needs, or that his team needs, for him to be successful and allow the team to really come together. And then getting back to what I was saying about communication, coordination, kind of Duke coming into team fights at the proper timing, and these kinds of things. SKT has definitely shown towards the end of the split, especially, issues in their coordination, and are they all on the same page? Are they trying to make the same play at the same time? Is Duke being asked to teleport into a team fight as Gnar with only a third of a Gnar bar ready, and he's, they don't seem to quite be talking to each other, and we've seen moments where they're clearly frustrated with each other or with themselves or whatever it is. There are moments when Faker and Bang will suddenly start to try to take things into their own hands and just make something happen and force the issue, and you can see that there's frustration there, and that's been a big problem. And I think part of that comes from Faker is used to being, you hear Faker playmaker. Well, it's not just because it rhymes. He's a very aggressive player. He likes to go out there and make things happen himself. And when he sometimes gets put on champions like Karma or something like this, who are very supportive. And they're not even like he used to be one of the Lulu players who was really fun to watch, because Lulu is a supportive champion, but he would go out there and he'd carry with it, he'd make plays with it, because it does have some of those types of tools. But a champion like Karma really doesn't. When he goes on these champions, and the entire team suffers because the rest of the players, there isn't really a dominating playmaker in there. Like when Bang plays Ashe, he can definitely use his ultimates well. Wolf is very flexible. He does a lot of things well. He can play a good Alistar or whatever it needs to be, but he doesn't go out and take over every game that he's in when he has the chance to. Like he's kind of a secondary, like a backup playmaker, and he'll step up when he needs to, but not super reliably. Duke, the challenging kind of communication issues that seem to happen on how he gets into fights, he's not always reliable as a playmaker either, even though he is capable of it. And then we've got Blank, and that's Blank. He's got some problems. So I think when you've got Faker not being put into, whether it's the champion meta or whether it's what the team is trying to do, with their comp designs, whatever it is, there's some frustration there that he's not able to go out and lead the playmaking and do everything that he wants to do. Also, he needs help from his jungler if he's going to secure his lane and be allowed to roam effectively, because he wants to roam, and sometimes you can see he's kind of starting to cheat out of lane, and it's like, oh, well, the situation isn't there. If Blank was with him, or if Blank had set up the vision or whatever, the area control properly, maybe that roam would work out. But these are some of the issues that SKT is having. And yet, I put them number 1 in the group. A big reason for that is just I just have so much trust in what Koma can do as a coach, what these players can do in their ability as veterans to all come together. I think they've had a ton of time to work on all of these issues, and it's very hard for me to imagine a situation where they don't come in with at least enough of these problems solved to take the group against these teams, all of whom have some issues. I don't think they're coming up against anyone who's really like a super dominant team. They're not up against EDG or someone like this who's likely to punish them in all of the areas they can be punished. Even their early game, even with Blank being a liability and Cloud9, Flash Wolves having a pretty good early game, I'm not sure anybody can really do enough to shut down SKT to the level that their experience, their team fighting, their just general skill level can't take over. So that leads into my question for them is how much will Blank be tested, which I'm trying to get at that early game, like how much will SKT's jungler issue in the early game be exploited by these opposing teams. So these are my thoughts on some of the 4 teams. Again, why I'm looking at IMA as the 4th team, Flash Wolves 3rd, Cloud9 2nd, SKT 1st. If you've got any questions on those, definitely feel free to leave some questions in the comments in the video. Shoot me a message on Twitter, whatever you want to do. I had some questions on Twitter already, most of them about Group D, so I can draw on some of those if and when I do the video on Group D. But for this group, hit me with your questions. I'll maybe do a follow-up video if I have those, or I can respond directly to them. And otherwise, hope you enjoyed the video. Hope these thoughts on these teams were kind of interesting and useful, maybe a different perspective for you from somebody who's not necessarily, I didn't follow LPL, LMS all season, so this is coming outside and maybe bring a fresh perspective on it, and maybe just a wrong perspective. But if you feel that way, let me know. We'll have a conversation about it. Otherwise, thanks for watching.